The year is 1996. Sony's fancy new PlayStation is inching its way towards its second year on the market. While support for the system was strong, it had yet to receive a real flagship title, a killer app if you would. And yes, pun intended, because today we're talking Resident Evil. Sorry, that was on my bucket list for the video, let me just cross that off there. The original Resident Evil trilogy is a hallmark of gaming. 3 enduring classics that single-handedly changed the entire scope of what horror could achieve in video games. The story of Star's Spencer Mansion in Raccoon City is near and dear to the hearts of many die-hard fans like myself, but there wouldn't be many fans if the games themselves didn't captivate the players in the ways they did, fathering the entire genre of survival horror. While I respect the R remakes, I find it disappointing that they've effectively replaced the originals in series discussions. These are all insanely different experiences and should be seen as such, without the labels of better or worse. There's a ton of ground to cover here, so let's once again step into the world of survival horror and first take a look at the original Resident Evil, and what made it such an icon in the first place. The original Resi was definitely a product of its time, but before its time, horror games weren't exactly scary. The power, visuals, and sounds of hardware found in something like the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis were impressive in the 90s, perfectly suited towards the enthralling and fun experiences in their libraries. But horror was a different story. You'd be hard-pressed to find any truly scary or unsettling games from the 16-bit generation, and most of them weren't even localized outside of Japan. None could achieve what began with Capcom's Resident Evil, but what exactly did Resident Evil have that made it such an achievement? Well, it wasn't its acting talent.
Joseph!
The game opens up with a live-action cutscene, detailing how the events leading up to the game transpired, and how the members of STARS wound up in the ever-so-creepy Spencer Mansion. It's notorious in the community for being cheesy and completely unserious in its nature, but if that's not Resident Evil, I really don't know what is. While it's aged like a bag of milk, I appreciate the realism that was attempted in this intro, to create a link between the in-game characters and real people. The link ended up being terrible acting, but I still like it. It does its job, getting us right into the action. After some top-notch voice lines, of course.
Where's Barry?
Well, I'm sorry, but he's probably...
No.
While the voice acting and cutscenes have played a part in scaring away modern gamers, I'd say the controls are what scare them straight into the remakes. The first stage of Resident Evil's life involved the use of tank controls. Up always sent you up, down always sent you down, and left and right were responsible for turning. This doesn't really sound like a big deal. Resident Evil 4 famously retained the tank control scheme when it blew the gaming world away. But the divisiveness comes with the controls in conjunction with the camera. Fixed camera angles were Resi's bread and butter. It allowed the developers to constantly surprise the players and keep them on their toes. But they also caused players to feel disoriented by the constant shift of the environment. So many blame the controls when they really shouldn't. The controls do the job. These complaints are more in line with the camera angles disrupting their grasp on the controls. It feels like a cop-out to say that, but that's the point. Because without fixed camera angles, the horror of classic Resident Evil would be practically non-existent. The fixed angles were intentionally designed by the developers to incite the most fear and tension possible from the player. You never knew what was lurking around each corner, and you weren't supposed to know anyway. The best camera angles could tell their own story, and made you feel like a character in a horror movie, unaware of what lies ahead and feeling all the more terror because of it. Take a look at this small, claustrophobic room. It heavily contrasts with the more open or long hallways of the mansion. A bloody handprint is stained against the wall, inviting you up towards the elevated door, but your focus is so fixated on the door that you can easily miss the well-placed zombie in the adjacent hallway, hiding behind a blind spot ready to lunge at you. It's an older way of scaring the player, especially compared to what modern horror games are capable of, but it doesn't make it any less effective. It's an acquired taste, especially if you aren't into retro games, but these elements of classic RE grow on you considerably, and I'm speaking from experience. I started with Resident Evil 4, loved it, went on to the RE1 remake, which retained the controls and fixed angles of the original. I despised them at first, but they've grown on me so much that I wish smaller Resi spin-offs with the same design philosophy could still be made today. But that's getting a bit off track. The point is, RE1 and by extension 2 and Nemesis haven't aged as poorly as they've been portrayed, from purely a gameplay perspective. Believe me, it's not timeless or anything like that, but the gameplay still holds up enough. That's what I look at first and foremost when fleshing out my stance on a game, even more so with retro titles. Resi's moment-to-moment gameplay is so inherently solid that an action as simple as selecting a character gives you 2 very separate experiences while still retaining its core. Before you start the game, you're given the choice between 2 characters, Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. I prefer Jill playthroughs because her benefits outweigh Chris's in my eyes, but only by a slight margin. Chris has more health than Jill, he's much faster than Jill, and has less item space. Jill has more item space, better weapon variety, and a lockpick that makes exploration much easier. Both characters also have unique companions. Chris gets Rebecca Chambers, and Jill is accompanied by Barry Burden. Both companions have their uses. You can use Barry to negate the shotgun death trap, and he also makes the Plant 42 boss battle much easier by stepping in. Rebecca can read sheet music unlike Chris, the uncultured swine, so you need her for the piano sequence, and the V-Jolt chemical puzzle to weaken Plant 42. The game treats the choice between Chris or Jill as choosing hard or easy modes respectively, but I don't think it's as simple as that. Chris's extra health means that a player can afford to make more mistakes than they can on a Jill run, and while she has more benefits on paper, the difference in health is a huge downside to Jill. So huge that I consider the characters to be more than just an easy or hard mode. They're two separate but equally solid ways to play. Item management is the name of the game here. You can only have so much space to carry some of the many items scattered around the mansion. Ammo and health items like herbs and first aid sprays are in limited supply, so as you're navigating the hallways, you have to be constantly aware of what you're holding, what their uses are, and how to strike an appropriate balance between them. If you want to stock up on ammo for boss encounters, your best course of action would be to avoid the common enemies laid about. But if you're too stingy and can't juke your way out of every situation, you're going to end up getting cornered, and it will not end well. The only way I could describe Classic Resi is that it's a game of give and take. Figuring out the right time to practice caution or take action is crucial. Key items have to be factored in as well. There may be times when you have to carry multiple key items to progress, which means less ammo and less herbs. You could be really safe and stick to one key item at a time, but it comes at the cost of time. There's no downside to being a slowpoke in RE1, but making a ton of progress in one go always feels rewarding. The atmosphere in RE1 as a whole is arguably the best in the series, and the sound design and music are still top-notch. The PS1 was a great leap forward for the entire industry. Its CD format allowed for sound and atmosphere on a level that was pretty much non-existent for any console beforehand. The most fleshed out area is without a doubt Spencer Mansion itself. It's a true labyrinth, so you'll be spending most of your time here. Memorizing its layout is going to be the difference between getting where you need to be or wandering around avoiding zombies, but the addition of the hunter enemies once you return to the mansion is really what keeps you on your toes on every playthrough. They're fast, chase you with ease, and can easily kill you if you're careless. Their implementation is what makes this the most fun section of the game in my opinion. I don't find any section to be particularly bad, but the final lab section leaves a little more to be desired. It's fairly short and straightforward compared to the other areas, and it's pretty easy to fly through it. The only time it genuinely frustrated me was my first time through. I was a little cocky without stopping for saves and lost around 30 minutes of progress. But that's just the name of the game with Classic Resi. Speaking of saving, I don't think there's any series in gaming that has made saving feel as impactful as Resident Evil did. Save rooms separate the perilous parts of the map and allow a moment to compose yourself. You're in a safe space where nothing will disturb you. Entering one immediately washes away your anxiety. As you hear the calming music, you're offered a temporary respite of peace and the chance to plan out your next move. Ink ribbons are used to save your progress, but like most other items, they're in limited supply. You can't have Resident Evil without some puzzles, though. I'd go as far as to say a true RE experience can only be as strong as its puzzle design. Too elaborate or confusing and you're bound to lose some people along the way, but too straightforward and the game will feel like too much of a cakewalk. In terms of puzzle design, RE1 is a solid foundation. You have your classic block-pushing shenanigans here and there, but the more riddle-centric puzzles are especially rewarding to solve without a walkthrough. But all in all, you get what you sign up for here. I'd go as far as to speak about the bosses in a similar fashion. Nothing terrible, but nothing mind-blowing either. Bosses have evolved to become equally important to the RE core as the map or puzzle design, but the first set of them in the franchise's history aren't particularly impressive. Yawn the giant snake is iconic, as is Tyrant the final boss, but all of these bosses are simply bullet sponges. If you have the ammo and health, you're going to succeed. If you don't, then they are a hell of an endurance check. But I applaud them for being that much at least. It all goes back to item conservation and playing smart without blowing all your resources away, because you're going to sorely need them for these guys. If you don't have the stash, you might have to consider reloading a previous save. That's a pretty intimidating consequence, but I like it. I'm a masochist, what can I say? Getting through the game gives you 8 possible endings, 4 for each character. What it comes down to is if the player escapes by themselves, with one companion, or both companions. Although there's not much variety between the endings in general, they're a fun thing to look into and figure out the triggers behind. Once you're done with the game, if you've achieved the best possible ending, where everybody survives, you get a closet key, giving you access to a few different costumes. The director's cut of the game also gives you access to a special arrange mode, which features different camera angles, item placements, and enemy layouts. As a side note, I wanted to talk about the odd regional differences between the original Western and Japanese versions of the game. Usually in retro games, you'd see the Japanese version as the more difficult one. But for whatever reason, the Western version of Resident Evil is significantly harder than the Japanese version. In Japan, you have an auto-aim function that simply does not exist in the original Western release. That's pretty damn weird. But it was fixed in the director's cut, which is another reason to just play that edition of the game. The original Resident Evil has 3 different mainstream releases on PS1, not even including the regional differences, which as I pointed out can alter the game pretty drastically, and 3 different ports for the Sega Saturn, PC, and DS. The Sega Saturn has its own post-game extra called Battle Mode. This mode was designed for players to defeat waves of enemies at a time in 15 different stages, but if you're looking for the best option to play on PS1, the director's cut is the way to go. Unless you're Japanese, then the best option would be the DualShock edition, the 3rd mainstream release which lets you use thumbsticks. Now if you're wondering why everyone else chooses the director's cut, it's because the DualShock edition, everywhere outside of Japan, reverts the difficulty back to the original US release. For me, the best version of the original game is the port for the DS, Deadly Silence. I'm surprised they didn't just slap a DS at the end and call it a day like literally every other DS game on the planet. These letters mean something for once. You get a rebirth mode that takes advantage of the touch screen for new puzzles along with the classic mode based around the director's cut. You can always have a map to look at without pausing, a quick turn, quick reload, and backup knife you don't have to equip are added to the game, which are much appreciated quality of life additions. But by far the greatest addition is the ability to skip the door cutscenes. Yes, you heard that right. You don't have to actually sit and wait for the loading screen, like every other classic Resi. If you can access this game in any way, you 100% should. The ROM of this game is easily available.
Is that legal?
I will make it legal. Resident Evil 2.
When it comes to video game sequels, it's difficult to top what the original Resident Evil 2 did for the series. More bombastic and action-packed than the previous entry, Capcom set out to make 2 feel like a big-budget movie sequel compared to the first. 2 still retains a good amount of the horror from 1 as well. The scale of the zombie outbreak has been tuned up to 10,000, with the T-virus infecting all of Raccoon City now. But the game went through what seemed to be a slightly dodgy development cycle. There's an entirely different beta out there dubbed by fans to be Resident Evil 1.5. The biggest difference was the inclusion of Elsa Walker, who was eventually replaced by Chris's sister, Claire Redfield. Claire makes her way to Raccoon City to find her missing brother, which causes her to cross paths with Leon Kennedy, a rookie cop on his first day on the job. I personally like this duo much more than Chris and Jill. They interact more and have as much of a chemistry as you could with that classic PS1 voice acting. But still, the connection between Claire and Leon is stronger, while also being the focal point for the entire Resident Evil 2 experience. This is because each character gets their own scenarios in-game. Disc 1 of the game is reserved for Leon playthroughs, while Disc 2 was designed for Claire playthroughs. You could start the game with either disc, but must stick to the end of that playthrough before swapping out the discs and completing the scenario with the second run. This approach to character implementation remains the best Capcom has ever done for the RE games, and for whatever godforsaken reason, scenarios were never used again. Hell, even in the remake, both playthroughs are essentially exactly alike. Same bosses, same puzzles, different cutscenes. That's it. They didn't do the originals justice in that way, but that's an entirely different story for an entirely different video. The biggest difference between A and B runs, though, is one monster, Mr. X. This stalker-type enemy was the prototype for another more intricate enemy that I will be gushing about shortly, but Mr. X is an excellent addition to the B scenario as a way to up the difficulty. He'll burst into the scene in certain rooms and it's up to you whether to run away or attack the creature. If you defeat it, he'll drop a nice stash of ammo for you, so the reward outweighs the risk. If your first experience of Mr. X was the remake, he doesn't appear nearly as much as he did there, and doesn't hold the same impact either. But as the first stalker-type enemy in the series, Mr. X lays a solid foundation for future enemies in the series. But what kind of RE game would this be without an expansive map? As a starting area, the RPD is practically perfect. Its progression feels natural, and its secrets and puzzles are all weaved together into the police chief's insane schemes around the department. The RPD was pretty straightforward. Backtracking isn't nearly as relevant as it was in RE1, but that helps the RPD as a starting area. You also leave the RPD fairly quickly in the average playthrough. However, the amount of zombies per room is staggering as you make your way through the area. Going from RE1 to RE2 and seeing a room with this many zombies will guarantee you soil your best gaming pants. But the effective jump scares die down once you make your way out of the RPD and into the short sewers section, then the even shorter factory section, and of course the obligatory lab area. Besides Mr. X, there are a few new monsters and bosses to uncover. Lickers are the premier new enemy type. Think of them as a kind of hunter. Lickers might have the greatest introduction in the RE games, debatably second to the first zombie appearance. You see the creature scurry past the window. Then an angle of the next room is placed outside of a window, like something's watching you. Making your way through the hallway, you discover a huge splotch of blood and a licker hanging right above you. William Birkin, the creator of the TNG virus, works for the Umbrella Corporation during the events of the first game, until Umbrella attempted to steal his research. A special ops unit of Umbrella took him down, forcing him to use the G-Virus to keep himself alive, mutating himself into one of the only bosses in the game. The different bosses you encounter besides the cool giant alligator with the Jaws reference, and the B scenario's final Mr. X fight, are all different forms of William Birkin. They differ depending on the scenario, but I for one would have enjoyed some original bosses to throw down with. Although RE1 had a small number of bosses, they were unique enough from each other at least. Fighting the different Birkin forms is fine, but it doesn't get my blood pumping. In terms of getting our brains pumping, RE2 has without a doubt the easiest puzzles in the trilogy. This might have to do with the sequel's more straightforward approach than the confusing labyrinth of the first game, but I can't think of a single puzzle that required more than just a little brain power. The amount of puzzles compared to the first seemed lesser as well. If you're looking for something more based in simplicity, I'd pick RE2 over RE1. But the gameplay here isn't that vastly different. Conserving your items and planning your next move is still on huge display here. The added element of a ranking system inspired a multitude of fans to start speedrunning RE2. The ranking system itself is a bit overbearing. For the top rank of A, you need 270 points. You can do this by beating the game in under 3.5 hours with only 3 saves used and 0 first aid sprays used. You can mix around the priorities if they end up with the same result. But for a flawless A rank of 300 points, you have to beat the game in under 2.5 hours, use 0 saves, and 0 sprays. Every save used, spray used, or added time spent will bring your score down. I never thought I had what it took to get an A rank until I discovered you need to get one to unlock the secret Fourth Survivor minigame. It was then I discovered the true pain of duty. I started by staggering through my first A rank on Leon A, then doing a quick C rank of Claire B to finish the scenario. I then discovered that an A rank on an A scenario doesn't unlock shit, so I reversed the order, a quick C rank on Claire A, and then after a solid month, an A rank on Leon B. Now I could finally discover the magic of the Fourth Survivor minigame. And there is no magic. This shit is hard as balls. The Fourth Survivor mode sees you playing as Hunk, one of the special ops who attempted to steal Birkin's G-Virus. Your new objective is to reach the helicopter on the RPD route from the sewers before getting left behind. And let me just preface this mini-review by saying this mode is hard as all hell's bells. Although Hunk is by far the tankiest character in the game, he only has a limited amount of ammo and the worst set of health items possible. The blue-green mix does barely anything for your health. The key to surviving Fourth Survivor is to become a master of dodging and picking the right times to fight, but you'll find your ammo and health always depletes faster than you'd like. I consider the Fourth Survivor a challenging reward for people who have mastered RE2, but I don't think it's really necessary for the overall experience. You don't need to play Fourth Survivor, but if you want to see everything the game has to offer, it's right here. There's a few other extras to unlock here as well. When you beat a full scenario, you'll unlock EX Battle Mode. You could see this as a kind of precursor to the mercenaries. You can play as all sorts of different characters, including Chris Redfield, Ada Wong, and Hunk. But EX Battle is organized by levels, each with their own distinct mission to accomplish. It's a fun little escape from the main game, but that's about it. Then you've got Tofu Survivor, which is exactly the same as Fourth Survivor, except you play as Tofu. You only have access to the knife, by the way. I don't know how players can get through this, but even to just unlock this mode, you need a flawless 300-point A rank run in every scenario. I will never, ever attempt that, but more power to whoever did. You're our big winners. Now let's check out our big loser. Brad Vickers was the former pilot of Stars in the first game. He's the one that ran away like a coward in the intro. But he comes back at the end to save his friends. Now he's dead. To find Zombie Brad, you have to get to the RPD without picking up any item. Once you kill him, he drops this special key, unlocking alternate costumes for Leon or Claire. It's a sneaky Easter egg and one that's especially rewarding. Resident Evil 2 has 2 versions on the PS1 as well as ports to the Dreamcast, GameCube, and N64. The DualShock version of RE2 was the second release. Like RE1's DualShock release, it added support for the rumble and analog features of the DualShock controller. The DualShock analog version is the one to go with for the most options, but I recommend just using the directional buttons because an analog stick slightly messes with the tank control scheme. However, I found it easy to maneuver around bosses with analog, so it's really the player's choice. The GameCube edition is a completely unmodified version of the game. There's no reason to pick this over the DualShock release, but it's a novel showing of how much Capcom supported Nintendo at this time. The Dreamcast release didn't have any defining characteristics either, besides the fact that your character's health would appear on the real-time display of the VMU peripheral. It also carried a demo for Code Veronica. But the N64 release of RE2 was an honest-to-God technical marvel of its time. A small staff of 10 workers with some help from another 10 Capcom staff managed to compress 2 CD-ROMs with 700 megabytes per disc into a single cartridge with 64 megabytes of space. The N64 version also offers features and extras not seen in any other version of the game, like more alternate costumes, the ability to adjust in-game violence and blood color, a freaking randomizer that mixes up item placement, and new secret files known as the X-Files. Not the X-Files, EX-Files, X-Files. Like the one you still cry every night over. This connected the lore of RE2 to games of the past and games that weren't even out yet. It's incredible that such a port even exists, but I'm glad it does because it sounds so goddamn cool. If I had a gun to my head and was forced to pick my favorite PS1 game, I would say Symphony of the Night, because I have standards. But if I was forced to pick my second favorite PS1 game, then I'd resort to Resident Evil 2. Everything from the action-packed presentation to the extras and ranking system, the game kept me coming back to it again and again. And yes, while it's not without its flaws, I'd recommend this to any Resident Evil fan curious of looking into the classics. Now, the game I was most excited at looking into was Resident Evil Nemesis, because, well, I've never played it. Yes, despite my love for RE1 and RE2, I've never gotten around to playing Nemesis, so let's quit the chatter and jump right into it. Resident Evil Nemesis was originally envisioned as a side project to the series. It was then labeled as the third mainline game to keep it consistent with the rest of the PS1 titles. This is because the devs considered the true sequel to RE2 Code Veronica. The plot to Resi 3 revolves around Jill Valentine's last few days in Raccoon City during the zombie outbreak as she mounts her own escape attempt. As she fights her way through the hordes of monsters on the city streets, she reunites with the very soon-to-be-dead Brad Vickers. He mentions something that's going after STARS members before running away once again, but when you meet up with him later on...
Brad!
We've got a...
This is of course the titular monster, Nemesis. He and his many encounters form up the backbone of this entire game. I love his design, just this lumbering giant monstrosity with a friggin' rocket launcher strapped to him. The outline of a creature like Nemesis had already been made in Resident Evil 2 with Mr. X, but instead of being a new addition to pro players going through a second scenario, Nemesis will stalk you practically from start to finish. Beating him nets you rewards like Mr. X, but the rewards are for new gun parts or first aid sprays, which means your ammo isn't getting replenished. But you do get shiny new toys like the Eagle and an improved shotgun. His presence is so powerful that he can stop the save room music from playing when he's nearby. It's also worth noting how Nemesis is weaved into the many new mechanics of 3, because for a side project, there's a lot on the table here. The most crucial change to the general gameplay here is the dodge mechanic. This element of 3 is what slowly gets the ball rolling for the franchise to become more action-oriented, which eventually came with its own gripes. But here it's a decently neat mechanic. As the name suggests, you're now able to dodge out of the way of incoming enemy attacks. Each attack has its own timing, so you can't just mash the dodge button whenever you like. Some enemies like Nemesis himself telegraph their attacks blatantly, as opposed to your average run-of-the-mill zombie, which I found surprisingly harder to dodge. It's got that core of being easy to grasp while also being difficult to master, which I appreciate. The dodge mechanic makes Nemesis encounters and boss fights more technical and intimate compared to other bosses in the previous games. If I could add a dodge to Resi 2, I 100% would. That'd be so much fun to experiment with. And for the first time in the series, another evasion technique, the quick turn, is added to the game. You can also mash out of enemy holds now, which was something I always did in the other two, pretending like it had some effect on the game. But now it actually does. The ammo in 3 is more scarce as well. You don't really find them as regular ammo pickups anymore, you find gunpowder, which you then combine with a reloading tool to transform it into ammo. There's A, B, and C gunpowder, and any random combination of the three will net you a different kind of ammo. I saw a ton of guys recommending getting freeze ammo for the launcher to deal with Nemesis, which came from Gunpowder CC, but I always went for Gunpowder CCC to get Magnum rounds, exclusively to deal with boss fights. Another cool feature in this game that once again has never returned and wasn't even redone in its remake was the pathway system. There are a plethora of moments in RE3 where the game slows down and you're given a choice. If Nemesis appears, you're given two different choices to either escape from him or to combat him. It's not always beneficial to run in the choices segments, though. Running can sometimes guarantee that Nemesis will immediately chase you after the fact. Different paths aren't limited to these direct moments, though. Characters can be met in unique ways depending on the area you find yourself. There's a bunch of little cutscenes and alternate routes you can take, and it constantly keeps the game refreshing and less of a chore to return to. The areas of the game are also interesting to take a look at. We only saw a bit of the city streets in RE2, but here they're pretty damn detailed. It really feels like Raccoon City was a living, breathing place with so many different kinds of attractions and important city buildings. There's bars, restaurants, gas stations, convenience stores, it's got a city hall, cable car rails. It's a fine pocket of undead suburbia. Seeing a side of the RPD before it is the way it's presented it to is awesome as well. The clock tower felt a bit like it was Spencer Mansion light. I felt as though the area itself was a bit too light, however, and could have been expanded upon much more. Most of your time in this game is going to be spent at the city streets, then a brief moment in the RPD, back to the city streets, and then the clock tower. The graveyard isn't even worth mentioning because it's so small, and then the final area of the game, the factory. The smaller scope of the game definitely comes from the fact that it was envisioned as a spin-off of the main series, so I'll give it a pass. The puzzles here aren't too bad either. I thought the puzzle where you have to match up the polluted water with your own sample was a decent one. But again, there's nothing that requires too much brain power here, and that's just the way dummies like me like it. I found zombies to be at their most aggressive and fast here, which makes sense when taking into account the dodge mechanic, so your average run-of-the-mill zombie was revved up to match the more intense style of the game. But I wanted to take the time to dump on how Capcom handled the bosses in 3, because bosses are once again an afterthought, besides Nemesis. 2 actually has more variety in this area, because in Nemesis you only fight Nemesis and this Sarlacc-looking thing 2 times. The Nemesis battles are done pretty well though, purely because of how fun the dodging mechanic makes them. Once you finally make it to the factory, you find out the President and the entire federal government have ordered that a nuclear missile strike Raccoon City to prevent the spread of the virus, so the clock is ticking. When Nemesis shows up again, you melt him in an ocean of acid, but that doesn't keep the persistent little bugger from rearing its ugly head again. This particle accelerator looking thingy needs to be powered up, so you push each battery, A, B, and C, into their place while running from this Nemesis blob. Once it's powered up and ready to go, just place your Nemesis blob in front of the gun, watch it get obliterated, rinse and repeat. You're given one last choice to leave the dying Nemesis there or finish it off yourself, and I don't think there's one person on planet Earth that didn't choose to exterminate the monster.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Now, like RE1, there's a couple different endings to delve into here. When you encounter Nemesis on the wooden bridge towards the end of the game, your choice to push him off or jump off affects the ending you'll be watching. If you chose to push him off, you'll get the false ending, where the secondary antagonist, Nikolai, is murdered by Nemesis in the factory. It's technically canon that Nikolai escapes Raccoon City, thus the false moniker. For the true ending, you must jump off the bridge. You'll find that Nikolai takes the chopper you needed to use to escape. That opens up the possibility for Barry from RE1 to come to the rescue. Barry fans rejoice! For completing the game, you get the first ever appearance of the Mercenaries mode. Mercenaries is a staple of the Resident Evil series, so it's novel to see its humble beginnings here. The list of characters amounts to 3 mercenaries, Carlos, Nikolai, and Mikhail. I do wish there were more options like Hunk or Ada, but I'll forgive it for being the first mercenaries. Your objective is to make it across town under a time limit. The more creatures you kill, the more seconds you gain, with Nemesis giving you a ton of time if you actually best him. Your score earns you money, which you can spend on a few rewards in the main game. It's simple, but it's fun. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was an awesome experience for me on my first time through. There were some additions that I thought improved the classic RE formula, like the pathway system, dodging, and quick turns, but there were some that felt a little too backwards for me, like the gunpowder mixing feature. Nemesis is a fantastic stalking enemy, and may have been the peak of the archetype up until Mr. X came to take his crown back in the RE2 remake. Unfortunately, I'd place 3 at the bottom of the trilogy, but that's not really saying much when you have a trilogy that's so quality in the first place. But that's about it for this video. The original Resident Evil trilogy is a phenomenal example of classic survival horror, and in my personal opinion still holds up to this day. Each game is unique compared to the last one, and they all hold their own separate value from one another. The tank controls and camera angles may scare away modern gamers, but I enjoyed this side of Resi immensely. If you stuck around with me this long, I just want to say thanks for watching. This was a big one. If you want me to check out any other game trilogies, just drop a comment down below, and once again, thanks for watching.